You're listening to The Other 50%, a herstory of Hollywood. I'm Julie Harris Walker. This is the podcast where I talk to successful women in entertainment and hear their stories. And this year, every now and then, I'm going to talk with a man. Today is one of those days. Our presenting sponsor is the end-to-end production solution, Green Slate. Whether it's start paperwork, time cards, purchase orders, or reports, everything is digital, everything is on the app, and you can work from wherever you are. You can do it on your phone, on your iPad, on your desktop. The future is actually here. And if you'd like to hear this pitch in person or see it for yourself, call me and I will come over. I'm working there as the Senior Vice President of West Coast Operations. My number is 310-789-2001, extension 323, or jhw@gslate.com. Now back to my weekend job. For today's episode, I caught up with Jeffery Tobias Halter. I originally interviewed Jeffery for episode 13, which you probably have to find on the website since the podcast apps only keep the last 100 or so up. So this was before Me Too and Time's Up, and we were just exploring unconscious gender bias in the workplace. Doesn't that feel like about a million years ago? As a quick bio, Jeffery Tobias Halter is a gender strategist and the president of YWomen, that's the letter Y, Women, a strategic consulting company focused on engaging men in women's leadership advancement. Jeffery is the former director of diversity strategy for the Coca-Cola Company, and he's the author of 2 books, including Why Women, The Leadership Imperative to Advancing Women, and is a 2-time TEDx speaker. His clients include dozens of Fortune 500 companies, and he serves on the Board of Trustees for Miss America 2.0. Jeffery has been doing his work as a gender strategist for a long time, but I wondered how his work has ramped up and changed focus in recent days. Luckily, I got to ask him. You can find us at theother50percent.com for added features, photos, show notes, and the merchandise. I have very cool coffee cups and tumblers. You can also listen on Apple Podcasts and all the podcast places. Also, the full season of Catch a Break, The Insider's Guide to Getting Into and Navigating Hollywood, is available on Apple Podcasts and all the podcast places, and on the website, catchabreakpodcast.com. Go check that one out too. And we have just wrapped recording for season 2, and I have to tell you, it is really good. I have never been so proud of a project. We have some amazing guests and so much great information. I'll keep you posted as to when it will launch. All right, here's my conversation with Jeffery Tobias Halter. Have a listen. Jeffery Tobias Halter, we talked 3.5 years ago before the world turned upside down. And I remember the time we were talking about, let's explore unconscious gender bias, and is that a real thing? Which seems hilarious now in retrospect. I'm so glad we're reconnecting, and I really want to talk about what have you been doing in the last 3 years, and how have you seen the world completely change?
Yeah, it's so funny, and thank you again for having me on. I appreciate it. We are living in exponential times, and I think so much of it is driven by social media. And a lot of the work that I'm doing now is actually taking, I won't say a different tone, but I recently wrote a blog called Women Beyond the Tipping Point that looked back at literally since the time we talked, almost 4 years ago, on all the trends that have taken place and why I'm actually feeling encouraged in this day and age. Now the answer is not around the corner, but it's not going to take 100 years to get women to parity in the C-suite. And there's some amazing macro trends that are going on. There's some things going on in government and social. Corporations are stepping up, and I'll share all of those with you. But I'm actually encouraged for women's advancement at this point in time.
Well, that is encouraging. Let's just drill down specifically. Let's just talk about Me Too, first of all.
Okay, sure.
And when that happened and how that happened and how did that what was your perspective as that was kind of starting to shake out?
It's so funny. You can't I don't think you can just look at Me Too alone without looking at a couple of other macro factors. And that was, 3 years ago or so, 1 million women marched demanding their voices be heard. And so even, prior to Me Too erupting, women were gathering, women's voices were demanding to be heard. And then you kind of had this tipping point called Me Too, where it started out with 1 or 2 examples and Hollywood really unleashing all of the issues and challenges. But what's fascinating to me is there's some people, there's two schools of thought. One is this is going to go away. It's run its course. Another one is this antiquated notion that some companies are saying, oh my gosh, you can't talk to women. You can't travel with women. You can't mentor women. And that's not real leadership. Leaders today, doesn't matter the industry, need to be leading this conversation. They're just, being sophomoric if they think sexual harassment or more so hostile work environment is not taking place at their company. And shame on them if they're not demonstrating visible vocal leadership. And by the way, and I work with mostly Fortune 500 companies, but every one of them has a set of values on their wall. And we need to dust those off and say, if we're living these values and demonstrating inclusivity, we won't have these issues. So this is just role modeling the behavior that we have expected, but not monitored for a long time. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing is this is not going away. Think about this. There's about 40 million men in the workplace today, about half the workforce. If just 1% of them, and I think that number's low, are committing sexual harassment, that's 400,000 more Me Too headlines that we're going to live through. And so this is where companies need to be really vigilant and start, nipping this in the bud, or they're just going to be playing defense. They're going to be the next Uber. They're going to be the next Fox. We need leaders to get really, really serious about this.
So tell me, because you're a gender strategist, and I know you've been working with companies for a long time, how has your work and your focus changed in the last few years?
It has changed exponentially. What we're seeing is companies who are mindfully seeing women as a competitive advantage. And they are seizing this opportunity to go out and win the war for talent, talk differently in the marketplace. And in many regards, that's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Nike had its share of issues, but you just look out at the new ad that was released a couple of weeks ago around gender equity. They're certainly trying. A lot of the companies that I work with, quite frankly, are never going to make headlines. But I have probably a dozen companies now that I run a 7-hour session for 30 men at a time who want to get better at being gender advocates. And so picture that, Julie, 30 men in the room talking about women for 7 hours.
I love it.
I know what your listeners are going to think about. They're going to go, oh my God, what could men possibly talk about for 7 hours? And I am just astonished every time I run one of my programs. I'm always concerned men aren't going to say anything. And I have like 10 hours of material prepared to get through this. And we get through about 3 hours and we create a safe, supportive environment for them. And they talk about how can I be an advocate? What does it look like when I'm standing up for women? What does it look like when I'm correcting bias? And these aren't just big issues or big challenges they're taking on. It's subtle things like making sure a woman's voice is heard in a meeting, that her idea is not talked over. It's respectful behavior. It's sharing office housework. And so it's both big things and little things. But I'm very encouraged because I'm crazy busy. I was on the road 30 weeks last year working with companies who are choosing to want to get better at this.
I love hearing that because I was thinking as you were talking before, it's not just about stopping sexual harassment. It's about seeing women as fully equal humans in the workplace and in everywhere in the world. And even once we get all the sexual harassment out of the way, I think there's still a huge hill of, I remember the last time we talked, something that you said that struck me and stuck with me was that men look at women at work and women at home as 2 completely different creatures in 2 different compartments. And I think until we get past that, we're still going to have trouble. Are you seeing any shift in that?
What I'm seeing is a lot of great research, and the people who are then reading this research and taking action are actually moving into it. For all your listeners, there's a great free report that they should take back to their company and read. It's the McKinsey Women in the Workforce. It's the 2019 report, and it's free. And it lists facts and data about what's going on today. And it spends a lot of time talking about still this notion of non-equitable hours between men and women, and the fact that basically women leave one full-time job and go home to another full-time job. Mm-hmm. And the crux of the matter really boils down to one issue, and that is how can companies find a way to embrace flexibility and make it work? Because the easiest thing for every company to do, and this is the one thing women were asked, would you rather have another week vacation, a raise, a promotion, or more flexibility in your day? Overwhelmingly, women said more flexibility in my day, specifically from 3 until 6 in the afternoon, because that's when my life goes to hell. Mm-hmm. And oh, by the way, companies that do this well, women are getting back on their computers at 8 or 9 o'clock at night. Everyone's working 24/7. And so the smart companies, and believe it or not, I was with an engineering and construction firm in St. Louis. And so I'm in a room with 300 people, about 200 male engineers and 100 women engineers. And I challenged them. I said, look, you guys are engineers. You create amazing solutions. You build things. And I want you to change your frame of reference. Instead of saying we can't make flexibility work, if this was an engineering challenge, if this was building the next bridge across the Mississippi in 1855 and you didn't have steel, what wild solutions would you have come up with to make this happen? And we brainstormed that for 20 minutes. So it's around changing the context to say we can't make this work to how do we make it work? And the companies that make it work have higher engagement, higher retention, and are better places to work for all employees, not just women.
Right, because I think men need that flexibility as well. If it's always framed in women need this flexibility because they're taking care of their children, but men don't have children.
Well, and millennials are demanding it. Millennial men are demanding it as well. Mm-hmm. And here's another number, so in the last 3 years since we've talked, and this is one of the trends that is going to help advance women. So I talk in my work around boomer retirements, the fact that, boomers, largely old white men like myself, are leaving. Well, since we talked, 10 million baby boomers have retired and only 3 million new workers entered the workplace. Now, technology can start to fill some of that gap, but basically with a growing economy, and the economy is growing, there's now a war for talent going on, and that's only going to escalate. So over the next 7 years, all the boomers will leave, and the new entries into the workforce will not be able to replace them. And so this is how companies are starting to think about it. You're asking, who's doing this well? I go back to one of my clients, Bristol Myers. I was talking to a senior scientist, and he has 16 openings for organic chemists, and he's based in Princeton, New Jersey. And there are 50 companies within a 50-mile radius that are competing for talent. And he said, I don't care what work hours you want. I don't care if you're red, black, blue, or green. I need smart people. And so this demand for talent is, quite frankly, I believe one of the tipping points, again, that are going to accelerate women because they've been sitting at the VP ranks for so long that they're the available talent when the last boomers leave.
Mm-hmm. Now I'm going to switch gears a little bit because I know the focus a few years ago, trying to get men to see the value in advocating, the argument was you have a wife or a daughter or a sister or a mother. Have we been able to shift that conversation to because women are humans and add value to the workplace?
Boy, I would love to tell you that the answer to that is yes, right? But, in my work, I find in creating advocates, I believe it's 80% head and 20% heart. And the head piece is all this data and numbers that I share, and the 20% is the heart piece. Now, I'm not saying you can't be an advocate without the heart piece, but I will say it's very hard for most people to advocate for anything without a personal connection. If you don't know someone going through it, the argument I like to use it's the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. So are diet and exercise. and that's been as well documented as advancing women. Yeah. And yet we have the worst obesity problem we've had in history. And we have the worst problem advancing women that we've had in history. So I don't know, correlation? I don't think so. But I have just found advocacy takes a personal commitment. But here's something for your listeners. So I actually created about a year ago, and it's a free test you can take at my website, www.YWomen.biz. And there are two versions. There's a male advocate profile and there's a gender advocate profile, which women and other gender nonconforming people can take. It's a 20-point questionnaire. And the first 10 questions are how you think about gender equity. And the next 10 questions are the actions you take. And what's fascinating, I have men and women take it. No great surprise. People think about gender equity much more than actually taking visible action. But the important thing here is women also don't take as much visible action as you would think they would. So that's how we've got to shift the dialogue from this is a nice thing to do, which I consider to be an ally, to an advocate, which says we're going to move into this challenge and choose to work differently.
Okay, so then what does advocacy look like? What are some real tangible things people can do to be a real advocate?
Yeah, it's really broken down into, I'm going to start with the barriers and then I'm going to give you the solutions if that's okay.
Great.
So right now, the current research shows about 4 barriers to why we aren't making more progress. The first one is empathy, lack of empathy. I don't believe men and women are having different experiences in the workforce. The next one is apathy. I don't see what the big deal is. Number 3, lack of accountability. If it's not important to my boss or my paycheck, why should I care? And the fourth one is fear. I'm scared to death I will say or do the wrong thing. And quite frankly, as a man, I can have a pretty good career without ever choosing to do this work. Mm-hmm. And so the solution is listen, learn, lead, and have the will. So let's start with listen. Listen is how you resolve empathy. And that is take a woman to coffee and ask a simple question. What don't I understand about the experience you're having here? And Julie, most women aren't going to say anything in that first 10 minutes. You don't want to represent all women in the company. And then men have to very respectfully say, please tell me what I don't know. And then shut up and listen. Don't say, oh, we got a program for that. We got a policy for that. Just listen and then ask a third time. And in that last 10 minutes, men are going to hear things that they never realized went on in their company. And that's how you start to become an advocate. It's through empathy. I have a personal connection. From an apathy standpoint, that's where we've got to talk about the business case. What does the business case look like? I've talked about talent. It could be revenue. It could be engagement. It could be innovation. It could be a whole host of business drivers. But it's this notion of prove to me it's a big deal. And oh, by the way, you have to prove that on my terms, connecting it back to me. And then the accountability one is really important. This came out of the McKinsey research as well. 78% of leaders said the business case was critical to their company, but only 17% held people accountable to any measure or scorecard. Well, think about that. If I asked you to go direct a movie and said, I'm not going to give you the budget, but you know what? You better not come over. How can I hold you accountable for that?
No, right? I do see that. People are afraid to say a number and think any progress is going to be great.
Yep.
Let's just do that.
And that's because there's, it's this belief, and many women as well. The belief is, if we track and promote women, it's just tokenism. That woman only got that job because she was a woman.
And if you name it, that should be enough. Because once people see it, of course they should want to do something about it. But as we've seen in the data for women represented in Hollywood, for example, it is not enough to talk about it incessantly. It still doesn't move the numbers.
Yes. And that's where, that's where companies, have to set guidelines, not quotas, guidelines to say 35% of our films will be directed by women. The one I still the jaw-dropping number to me comes out of the Gina Davis Institute.
Of course, yeah.
That in any crowd scene, it's 17% of the crowd scene is women. Mm-hmm. And, oh, by the way, 90% of casting directors are men. You want to drive change? I want, 50-50 casting directors, men and women. Doesn't that just make sense? You know?
It's funny because I think that does come to gender bias. I was recently in a company meeting where people were talking about gender and capturing gender and non-binary in like payroll information. And someone said, well, if you don't know, you pick male because male is the default gender. And of course,
Exactly.
my head exploded in this meeting.
Right.
I was like, how can you even say that? But yes. I think that's just, men is the default. So if you're going to make a crowd, men are the default.
Yeah. And then the last piece in this accountability piece is because so two things. One on tokenism. And this is really kind of funny, right? Because the belief is if we mandate diverse slates, so one of the three candidates has to be, in fact, a woman. There's this belief that she's not qualified. Well, you have to put pressure on your talent group to say, no, you're going to go find a woman and she's going to be talented. I work with Gallo, and Gallo says you wouldn't use bad grapes to make good wine. So we would never compromise quality just to promote women.
Well, the funny thing about that assumption is if you meet a woman who has actually made it to that level, she's usually quite a bit better than her male counterparts because she's had to be. Right. So then the assumption is, you're just a token. It's such nonsense. It's amazing.
Yes. And then the last piece of accountability is, so this is the one that I just love is, well, we don't have any women ready now. And by the way, I'm going to give you that one time. But the next time, Jim, you have a job open and you tell me I don't have any ready now women, I'm going to wonder what you've been doing to get some ready. And so, you know what? You get to use that excuse one time. And after that, we got a problem. But men never ask that question. They never ask the follow-up question. And then the last one's fear. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, as a leader, it is literally your job to develop the people underneath you.
Exactly. And then the last one is fear. And the way to overcome fear is to have the will. And that's that personal connection. That's how you choose to correct bias. That's how you move into these things. That's how you challenge antiquated notions. And part of that as well, one of the things I wanted to touch on is this notion, that's been in the news lately, and it's called forced arbitration. And, basically what it says is literally every employee in America, when you sign when you join a company, you sign like 25 pages of documents. Mm-hmm. Well, in there is a forced arbitration clause. And this is particularly harmful for women because what the research shows is if you are sexually harassed, we're going to buy you off. You have to keep your mouth shut. And as we've seen the research, you may never work in your industry again and you can't tell anybody. And to date, only a handful of companies, including Google and Microsoft, have taken forced arbitration out of the employment contract. So this is a huge one where companies need to step up.
Yeah, it's deep and it's systemic. Let's talk for a minute about the BS that is companies like on Wall Street announcing they can no longer work with women in the workplace or mentor them or have meals because they're so afraid of being accused falsely of sexual harassment.
Yeah, and that's just bad leadership. That is just, those are the companies that, quite frankly, Wall Street needs to step up and hold accountable. And it actually goes back to this notion that this women beyond the tipping point. There's a couple things that are going on that your listeners may not be aware of. You're based in California. You might be aware of this one. The notion that, California is mandating now 3 women on boards on any publicly traded board by 2021.
Yeah.
And nobody likes mandates, but it's a great first step. Now, oh, by the way, the penalty is a whopping $300,000, which is nothing to a big company. But I think the shame factor when your company is on that list and you don't have 3 women, I think that's when the marketplace is going to react. And then we had the chairman of BlackRock who basically represents the New York Teachers Union and the California State Pension Plan, writing a letter saying we are not going to invest in companies that don't have a movement towards board equity. And to me, that's a huge statement, where investment firms are saying, now you need to draw the line and make people accountable. And so I think there are a number of things going on, but the companies that are saying, don't do this and don't do this, they're getting ready to be the next Blockbuster or Sears. If I was an investor, I wouldn't be investing in these companies. They're run by complete idiots, or they're run by men who have probably sexually harassed somebody in the past and are concerned that they're going to get called on the carpet. Well, you don't have to look any further than Uber to know there are no secrets. Travis Kalanick, I don't think, went to bed one night thinking he would lose the company he founded. And this is where this whole social media and women at the tipping point is coming. Millennial women aren't going to call HR. They're going to write a blog, and it's going to be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal.
It's going to be scorched earth.
Yes, exactly. And then you're playing defense instead of doing your job as a CEO, which is, you could have prevented this, 5 years ago. So
right. I think the message that should be loud and clear is if that's your position, A, you're a bad business person. B, you're a terrible leader. 3, you're an idiot. I mean, I think
absolutely
it's indefensible.
Yep.
I mean, we should just call them out for being incompetent.
So,
all right. So what should a company do if it is serious about this?
There's a number of different things. And the challenge becomes, there's not one answer. There's 15 to 20 interrelated things that have to work in unison to really drive accelerated change. But for companies that are starting, for companies that want to raise the bar, there's a few things you can do. It starts at the top, visible, vocal, senior leadership. Leaders need to be out in front talking about this. When you look at companies that have made huge progress, they've been at this for 15 or 20 years. Sodexo, IBM, Marriott, and so this long-term sustainable push to say this is important to us. So visible vocal leadership at the top, tied to many companies, the 50 best companies in the country at this, tie executives' bonus to the completion of a diversity plan. Now that is far beyond 35 women in X number of roles. It's an all-inclusive leveraging diversity and inclusion plan in the organization. And then you've got to have two groups engaged. What the research is showing, and this won't surprise you, middle managers and men are only engaged in at a 40% level in any diversity and inclusion initiative. And this is why the male engagement is so important. You don't have to convince women that advancing women's a really good idea. You don't have to convince people of color that advancing people of color is a good idea. You've got to convince men, and you've got to convince middle managers who manage all these people. And so again, groundbreaking companies are pushing this way down and training middle managers, holding them accountable, and engaging men as change agents. And even best in class is still only about 50% engagement, but that's a far cry from where most companies are. And then the third thing is you need a compelling change story. There's a concept called corporate gender fatigue. And what it says is we've been talking about advancing women for 20 years, and the numbers haven't moved. The companies that I have seen been successful have they've woven women's advancement or into an initiative around engagement or productivity or safety, or we just bought a new company and this is the new set of guidelines that we're going to operate around. And you can tell who these companies are. If you get in an elevator with an employee and you ask them, can they give you the 30-second reason that we have a advancing women initiative? And then it's all the programs and processes and other elements that you would think about. But those three are the big ones.
Okay. Now I know you can't uncouple the advancement of women with also all the diversity and inclusion of race, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic, like all of that. How much of that is also entangled in your work? And what is my question around this exactly? Like,
I think I know what you're asking.
Yeah. Okay, go.
Here's a neat term. That your listeners need to be aware of, and it's called intersectionality.
Yes.
And what it says is we can't just be talking about women. We can use, and one of the reasons I focus on gender is it's the easiest conversation to have. But you can't just talk about gender without talking about age, millennials, Xers, boomers, without talking about people of color, without talking about sexual orientation, about transgenderism or gender nonconforming. Because, and again, this is this great McKinsey report. They actually did research into women of color and lesbian women. And every time you add another dimension of diversity, the challenges become greater. And they have a term that they used, and it's called the onlys. And it's what do you do when you're the only one in the room? So if you're the only person of color, if you're the only lesbian in the room, what are those dynamics? And what the McKinsey research shows is 3 is kind of the magic number. That 3 is a number of inclusion where you will feel represented. And here's an interesting statistic, and I digress, but you'll find this interesting given the Gina Davis number we throw about. This McKinsey report asked senior leaders how many women out of 10 represents good representation in executive leadership. What number do you think? Out of 10 spots, what would most leaders say good representation is for women? Most men.
Oh, I think men think 20% is good.
10%.
Oh my God.
10% represents well represented.
So 1.
So if 1 out of 10 people in a room are a woman, men will say women are well represented.
Done. Check.
And here's the sad part. You ready for this? Women said the number was 4. Women didn't even acknowledge 5. They didn't even acknowledge parity. They'd settle for 40% right now.
I love Ruth Bader Ginsburg's answer, which is there should be 9 women on the Supreme Court.
Oh, we can only hope.
What do you think your work is going to look like over the next 3 years? Where are we headed?
That's so fascinating. I would like to think that a couple things. Companies are going to have to get serious, and it's driven by social media. It's driven by their pain points, and it's driven by winning in the marketplace. And you can't minimize any of those factors. And it's not to say we can't get worse, but in 3 more years, we will have 10 million more boomers, almost 12 million, leave the workforce. And in my work, I travel the country, and I'll just give you some numbers. So I went to a group called the Awesome Women of Supply Chain. 600 women gathered talking about the issues in supply chain. And everybody wonders, what's the big deal in supply chain? Well, your little box of Amazon stuff is not going to show up unless we have truck drivers. And oh, by the way, we need 100,000 truck drivers in this country today. I left that event and I went to the groundbreaking Women of Construction. This was 800 women in the construction industry. And they were talking about the fact that we need 200 skilled laborers in this country, welders and plumbers and steam fitters. I left there and I went to IBM, their big global summit. And today there are 400,000 job openings for cybersecurity experts. And you have to be a U.S. born citizen to get these jobs. And so I think that the companies are going to feel this immense war for talent. It's going to break this bond of flexibility. I'm going to take you, Julie, if you can give me 6 hours, if you can give me 4 hours 3 times a week, we fundamentally have to rechange the way work is done because what we're doing is not sustainable. And so I think you're going to see a lot of pain. I think smart companies are going to win because they understand this. And I think, we have been riding a wave of 12 years of economic prosperity. When the recession hits, and we know it's going to hit at some point in time, you're going to see some massive, massive companies going under because they have not embraced this change. So that's what I see.
You're just not going to be able to afford to discriminate anymore. Let's hope.
No, you can't.
Well,
no.
and it's funny because I was working for myself for 3 years and just recently re-entered corporate workforce land. And I noticed just in those 2 years, such an enormous shift in the flexibility people were offering and how it was matter of course. I was shocked at how quickly that has changed. For one,
I was at a recruiting event. I was at a conference. It was hosted by Deloitte, and Deloitte was talking. It was partial recruiting, partially best practices. 80% of their workforce is millennials. And Deloitte is having to change its model because millennials, the traditional consulting model is getting on an airplane 45 weeks a year. Mm-hmm. They can't find bodies. They can't find people who want to do this. So Deloitte is now having to change the way they're doing work. And at the cocktail party, I was talking to a senior leader from Booz Allen. Now, Booz does a lot of Department of Defense stuff and whatnot. They're not a warm, fuzzy place, right? They're in the defense industry primarily. He said for the first time ever, Booz Allen had an alumni event and said, we don't care why you left. We want you back and you name the terms and we will see if we can match it. And this is not because they're a warm, fuzzy company. It's they need people to make things work. And so I think, we've seen if there's one more thing to talk about, and this is the crux of the matter. We saw women at Google organize a global walkout. And I think that cannot be minimized. Mm-hmm. They were asking for an end to forced arbitration. They were asking for transparency in sexual harassment. They asked for a seat on the board. And I think you're going to see this collectiveness of people gathering to say, you know what, we're not going to take this anymore. And if you want us and you need us, you're going to have to fix this stuff.
Yeah, I think women have found their voices and they're not going back.
Yep. Nope.
Okay, what did I not ask you about that I should have asked you about?
I think that's all I've got going on. So,
okay,
that's all I've got going on.
How can people find you?
Go to my website, www.theletterYwomen.biz. One of the things, and please go to my website. I've got a number of free white papers. I have the MAP, male advocacy profile, gender advocacy profile. You can take this back to your companies for free. I have a newsletter that comes out every 3 weeks called Staff Meeting in a Box, Gender Conversation Quick Starters. And it's a short video or a short article for your team to read. And then there's 3 questions for you to talk about. Because all I want to do at the end of the day is get people talking about gender. And then the last thing is go out and download the Father of Daughter initiative and get other fathers to realize that they have a responsibility to do this work.
Well, I love your newsletter. I'm a subscriber. I think everyone should be reading that. Thank you so much for doing this. And we will check in again when the next wave happens.
All right. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
You've been listening to The Other 50%, A Herstory of Hollywood. I'm Julie Harris Walker. I'd like to thank Jeffery Tobias Halter for sharing his perspective. And special thanks to Jay Rowe, Danny Rosner, and Allison McQuaid for the music. Please find us on your favorite podcast provider and leave a review. And of course, on our website, theother50%.com, all spelled out, for added features, bios of our guests, and the merch. You can also follow us on all the social media platforms and go subscribe at catchabreakpodcast.com. Thanks for listening. See you next time.